Ever been scrolling through your feed and seen those videos? You know the ones. Some dude in a white robe, beaming from ear to ear, getting fully dunked backward into a river while a crowd cheers. It's dramatic, it's emotional, it's very wet. Then, maybe the next day, you see a picture from a friend's family event. It's inside a big old church, and a priest is dabbing a few drops of water on a tiny, slightly confused-looking baby's forehead. What gives? I mean, both of these events are called baptism. They are, in theory, the exact same Christian initiation ritual. But one looks like a scene from a gospel movie, and the other looks like a very formal bath time that the main participant is not enjoying. This isn't just some minor detail, folks. This difference isn't a footnote, it's a fault line. It's a disagreement that has sparked literal wars and brutal persecutions. In the 16th century, groups like the Anabaptists looked at infant baptism and said, nope, that doesn't count. Their solution? Rebaptizing adults. The establishment's solution? Mass executions by drowning, a grimly ironic punishment for their beliefs. So it all leads back to a pretty basic question. The story goes that the central character of this whole religion, Jesus, was baptized as an adult. Now, setting aside the total lack of solid, non-biblical evidence that this man ever existed, the narrative itself sets a clear precedent. Baptism is for consenting adults who've made a conscious choice. So if the main character did it one way, where in history did the whole baptizing babies thing actually come from? How did we get from a grown man in the Jordan River to a newborn at the font? That's the mystery we're cracking today. Let's get into it. Okay, so to figure out where baptizing babies comes from, we have to hit the rewind button. We're not starting with Christianity. We're starting with ancient Judaism, because nothing happens in a vacuum. In the world of Second Temple Judaism, water and ritual purification were everywhere. This wasn't a weird or fringe idea. It was a part of life. You had ritual hand washing, priests had to take special baths before temple service, and you had the mikvah. A mikvah is basically a ritual bath. Archaeologists have found them all over the place, near temples, in synagogues, even in private homes. And you'd use it for all sorts of things. A woman would immerse after her menstrual cycle or childbirth. A man might use one after contact with a dead body. It was about restoring a state of ritual purity. Think of it like a spiritual reset button. Crucially, a mikvah immersion was something you did yourself, and you could do it multiple times, and it wasn't just mainstream practice. You had ascetic groups like the Essenes, maybe the guys living out at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, who took it to another level. For them, daily immersion in water wasn't just about ritual cleanliness. It was tied to a deeper sense of moral and spiritual transformation. So the stage is set. Water is already a powerful symbol for purification. Enter the character of John the Baptist. Now, whether he was a real guy or a convenient literary invention to introduce Jesus, the story of what he did is what matters here. He took this whole tradition of water rituals and basically created a radical remix. He innovated. Here's how John's baptism was different, and this is key. First, it wasn't about cleansing from everyday ritual impurity. It was a one-time, public act. You didn't do this every month. You did it once to signal a profound change. You were repenting, turning your life around, and getting ready to join a new, holy community that was preparing for the end times. Second, and this is a huge change, it was administered by someone else. You didn't dunk yourself. John dunked you. This transforms it from a personal act of cleansing into a formal initiation, a public ceremony where you submit to the authority of the movement. This model, a one-time public initiation, performed by an authority figure to signal a moral transformation and entry into the group, became the direct blueprint for early Christian baptism. So, we've established the origin of the Christian ritual itself. It's a Jewish ritual, remixed. But it's still an adult ritual, based on repentance and a conscious decision. Which brings us right back to our original problem. Where do the babies fit in? So, we have a clear blueprint for an adult ritual, based on personal choice. But we also have churches full of baptized babies. How do historians explain this jump? Well, for a long time, the standard scholarly answer was a pretty straightforward linear story. A view championed by academics like Everett Ferguson basically says this: the original early Christian practice was, without a doubt, adult baptism. The evidence? You look at the New Testament. Take the story in Acts chapter 8. The Apostle Philip preaches to an Ethiopian official. The guy listens, he gets it, and then he sees some water and asks, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" He makes a conscious decision as an adult convert, and boom, Philip baptizes him. The story mentions no kids, no family, no household. It's a one-on-one adult transaction. This, according to the theory, was the norm. So where did the babies come in? Ferguson and others argue that infant baptism crept in later, and initially only as an emergency measure. You have to remember, infant mortality in the ancient world was brutally high, so if a baby was sick or on the verge of death, terrified parents would have them baptized as a kind of spiritual first aid, hoping to secure their salvation if the worst happened. It wasn't the standard, but it was a desperate exception. So, what was the big shift? What turned the exception into the rule? One name: Augustine. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, didn't invent infant baptism, but he gave it the theological rocket fuel it needed to become dominant. He did this by popularizing the doctrine of original sin. This is the idea that all humans, from the moment they are born, don't start with a clean slate. They inherit the guilt from Adam and Eve's screw-up in the Garden of Eden. So, in this view, a newborn isn't an innocent blank canvas, it's already spiritually stained, predisposed to sin. Once that idea takes hold, the logic shifts completely. Suddenly, waiting for a child to grow up and choose baptism seems like a reckless gamble. Infant baptism goes from being a last resort precaution to an absolute theological necessity. You have to wash away that original sin as soon as possible. And so, by the 5th and 6th centuries, this emergency practice became the standard, dominant rite in most of Christendom. It's a clean narrative, right? Simple, linear. Starts with adults, evolves to emergency use, and then Augustine hits the gas pedal. It makes a lot of sense. Almost a little too neat. But here's where that neat narrative gets blown wide open. Because whenever a story from history seems too simple and clean, it's usually because someone left out the messy parts. And trust me, this story is messy. Scholars today, like Robin Jensen, are pushing back hard against that linear, adults then babies model. They argue that the evidence doesn't show a neat progression, it shows a picture of diversity from way earlier than you might think. And they've got the receipts. Let's look at the textual evidence, because it's pretty stunning. We find people talking about infant baptism as early as the late 2nd and early 3rd century. That's a full 200 years before Augustine shows up to the party. Get this. Our first major mention comes from a guy named Tertullian, a fiery North African theologian writing around the year 200. And he's not introducing it as a new idea. He's complaining that it's already a common practice. He argues for delaying baptism, worried that these kids are too young to understand what's happening, too young to know Christ. He's concerned they might sin later in life and invalidate the whole thing. But here's the killer detail. He mentions the use of sponsors, godparents, who make binding guarantees for the child's future faith. That tells you these aren't emergency deathbed baptisms. This is a planned, structured ritual for healthy infants, and the debate was on. While Tertullian was pumping the brakes, another big-name theologian, Cyprian of Carthage, was hitting the gas. Writing around 250 CE, he actively defended infant baptism, arguing that newborns should be baptized immediately. He saw it as an act of mercy and love, a way to welcome them into the community right away. Then you've got Origen, another heavyweight from the 200s, who straight up claims that baptizing infants was a practice received from the apostles themselves. Now, whether that's historically true or just a classic case of appealing to authority to win an argument, the fact that he could even make that claim shows that the practice was already well established. It wasn't some weird new thing. To top it off, we have a 3rd century church manual called the Apostolic Tradition. It's basically a how-to guide for church life. And right there in the text, it gives explicit instructions. Baptize the little children first. If they can speak for themselves, let them do so. Otherwise, let their parents or other relatives speak for them. It couldn't be clearer. And it's not just the texts. The archaeology complicates the old story too. We have this image of early baptism being full-body immersion in a deep pool. But many of the earliest baptismal fonts archaeologists have found are surprisingly small, way too shallow for an adult to be fully dunked. This suggests that from early on, the method was also diverse. Maybe partial immersion, or just having water poured over your head, which incidentally works just as well for a baby as it does for an adult. So forget the neat linear model. The evidence from the 2nd and 3rd centuries paints a picture of a diverse, messy reality where adults, children, and yes, even babies were all being baptized, and people were already arguing about it. Which, of course, raises an even bigger question. If it was this common by the 200s, why is the New Testament totally silent about it? Okay, so this is the point in the argument where a lot of people very reasonably throw up a hand and say, whoa, Farid, if Tertullian was complaining about infant baptism in 200 CE, why isn't it mentioned in the New Testament, which was written more than a century earlier? It's a great question. The argument from silence is powerful. If it's not there, it probably didn't exist, right? Believers who support infant baptism will point to passages in Acts or 1 Corinthians that talk about entire households being baptized after the head of the family converts. But critics correctly point out that these passages never explicitly say, and their babies too. So we have silence. But what if that silence doesn't mean what we think it means? This is where scholars like Stephen Nicoletti come in with a fascinating counter-argument. Maybe the New Testament is silent on infant baptism because it was so completely normal and assumed that nobody thought they needed to write it down. Think about it this way. When you write an email to your coworkers, you don't start with, "Okay team, remember to breathe air and use language to communicate." You just assume everyone's on the same page. Mentioning it would be weird. Nicoletti argues that for the earliest Christians, initiating children into the family's religion might have been that same kind of goes without saying assumption. To get this, you have to understand the world they lived in. Our modern Western idea of religion as a personal individual choice you make as an adult would have been completely alien to them. In the Jewish world that this movement grew out of, your religious identity was communal from birth. Male infants were circumcised on the 8th day of life. This wasn't a choice. It was their formal entry into the covenant people of Israel. Done. No debate. And it was the same in the broader Greco-Roman culture. The family or household was the basic religious and social unit. Romans had a ceremony called the Dies Lustricus, a naming and purification ritual for infants just over a week old, which formally incorporated them into the family and its cultic life. From day one, you were part of your parents' religion. That was the default setting for the entire ancient world. So, Nicoletti flips the question on its head. He argues that if the early Christians had decided not to initiate their children, if they had created this new rule where kids were religious outsiders until they were old enough to make a conscious choice, that would have been the radical, shocking deviation from the cultural norm. That is what the Apostle Paul would have needed to write letters about, trying to explain this bizarre and unprecedented policy to confused converts. So, the silence in the New Testament might not be a sign of absence or disapproval at all. It might just be the echo of a shared consensus, an assumption so deep that it never needed to be spoken. The assumption that, of course, the kids are included. So let's recap. We've seen that the simple story of adults first, then Augustine made everyone baptize babies, doesn't really hold up to the evidence. The practice was around and being debated much earlier. And we have a pretty solid theory for why the New Testament might not have mentioned it at all. This brings us to the big question. Why did it become so widespread? If it was just one of several options, what pushed it to become the default setting for most of Christianity for the next 1,500 years? The truth is, there's no single definitive answer. The historical record from those first couple of centuries is murky, but scholars have proposed a few very plausible explanations that, working together, paint a compelling picture. First, there's the theological argument, that baptism became seen as a replacement for Jewish circumcision. For a new religious movement trying to create its own identity separate from its parent religion, this makes a ton of sense. Circumcision was the non-negotiable sign of the covenant for Jews. Early Christian writers, like our friend Cyprian, explicitly debated this idea, framing baptism as the new, less painful, and more inclusive sign for the new covenant. It was a powerful piece of branding. Second, there's the simple sociological explanation, family tradition and communal identity. This is less about high-minded theology and more about basic human nature. Parents want their kids to be part of their community. They want them to belong. For a small, often marginalized group like the early Christians, having a clear ritual to mark who was in the group was vital. Baptism was the official welcome. It was a public statement that this child belongs to this family and this faith. It's as simple as wanting your kid on your team. And finally, we have to talk about the harshest reality of the ancient world, high infant mortality. We can't overstate how common it was for children to die. In that environment, baptism offered an incredible source of pastoral comfort. For grieving parents, the belief that baptism provided a kind of spiritual protection or guaranteed their child's place in the afterlife would have been a powerful, almost irresistible comfort. And remember Cyprian's argument in the 250s? His passionate defense of baptizing newborns wasn't really driven by a complex theory of inherited sin like Augustine's would be later. It was driven by a much more immediate concern, the reality of death. It was an act of mercy in the face of tragedy. So you have this convergence of factors: a theological argument, a sociological need for identity, and a pastoral answer to the deepest fears of parents. It's not one cause, it's a web of them. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? Where did the practice of baptizing babies actually come from? Well, the first thing to do is throw out that neat, tidy story of a single, original, adults-only practice that got corrupted centuries later. The evidence just doesn't support it. History is rarely that simple. Instead, the picture that emerges from the textual and archaeological evidence is of a messy, diverse, and evolving landscape, right from the early centuries. Early Christian baptism wasn't one thing, it was many things. You had full immersion, you had partial immersion, you had pouring, you had the baptism of adult converts, which was obviously essential for a new, growing religion. And yes, you had the baptism of children and infants, likely happening right alongside the adult baptisms, as early as the 3rd century, and maybe even before. They all coexisted. The shift to infant baptism becoming the dominant mode wasn't a sudden revolution sparked by one man like Augustine. It was a slow, gradual evolution over centuries, pushed along by a powerful combination of factors: developing theology like original sin, deep sociological needs for family and community identity, and the raw, pastoral realities of living in a world with staggering infant mortality. It just goes to show you that when you dig into the history of any idea, you rarely find a straight line. You find a tangled web of human culture, fear, hope, and argument. The simple stories are comforting, but the complex reality is always where the real truth lies. Thanks for joining me down this rabbit hole. If you learned something, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay rational, stay curious. I'll see you next time.